Thank you, Jane, very much. I feel doubly at home. In the first place, I don't seem to have left home. All of New York seems to have come to the meeting tonight. Jane was a New Yorker. The Whitney and Roger Johnson, who were instrumental in setting this event up, are New Yorkers. And, of course, Dee and Jonathan were New Yorkers. I've been sitting here mourning that this musical was never produced. That is a great loss. I hope you appreciated not only the gorgeous song, but Dee's accompaniment of your singing. He works on the theory that the louder he plays, the harder you have to sing. And it works every time. You were really roaring out there tonight. It was great. Of course, I also feel at home because this is Boston. And I lived in Boston longer than any other place in my life. We lived here for 19 years entirely. I was a missionary in New England. And perhaps more important than the length of our time here was the fact that the great events of my early life took place here. I went to college and graduate school, served a mission, as I say, met Claudia while she was at Wellesley. We began married life here. We had 2 children in Boston and another in Providence. I was first made bishop here and then Boston stake president. These were really the great years. Boston, I will tell you, is also a source of great embarrassment to me. I have come to that time in life when my already faulty memory is slipping still further, and when old Boston friends approach me in the temple in Provo or wherever, they're often greeted with the panicked look of a deer in the headlights. And only a half an hour later do the memories come flooding back. And this reminds me of the man who was in my stage in life who was taking memory lessons. And he went to this class, and a friend was asking him about it, and he says, "Is it working?" He says, "Oh, yes, it's marvelous." He says, "Where is this class held?" And he said, "No, let's see now, just a minute. What is the name of that flower that has thorns on the stem?" And the man said, "Rose." And he says, "Oh, that's right. Rose, where is it that I have these lessons?" It happens to us all. Boston is also the place where I got the first purchase on the subject I wish to discuss tonight, the inner Joseph Smith. Every reader of a biography wants to know the inner life of the subject, what it felt like to be John Adams or Harry Truman. The need is all the greater in the case of Joseph Smith, where in recent years there's been a flurry of speculation about his psychic structure, most of it not satisfying to Mormons at all. These explorers of the inner Joseph Smith find him to be suffering from one psychological disease or another, and which accounts for his visions, and in effect diminish him as a person by painting him as sick. These works, plus this natural curiosity about the prophet, obliged me to speculate a little about the inner Joseph Smith in my recent biography. It seems suitable to discuss these observations here because my approach to Joseph's psychology was shaped to a large extent by work I did when I was in Boston many years ago. From 1963 to 65, I had a postdoctoral fellowship at Brown University. We're actually living in Providence, to work on the combined fields of history and psychology. The president of Brown, a man named Barnaby Keeney, soon to be the first director of the National Endowment for the Humanities, had devised a 2-year program for scholars wishing to explore another field. In the first year, The scholars were to give a course in their own fields to sort of establish contact with students and faculty. In the second year, to offer a course combining their old field with the new. My seminar, combining history and psychology, was entitled Varieties of American Character. To prepare myself for the seminar, I applied for my course. I applied for a seminar at Harvard taught by Erickson, a household word years ago, but not so well known today, who wrote a marvelous psychological study of Martin Luther and then another one on Gandhi. I was attracted to Erickson because he was pioneering a kind of psychoanalysis that seemed both sensible and respectful. I was repelled by the tendency of psychological studies to label their subjects with some diagnostic tag and thus reduce them to a hospital case. They're no more than a diagnosis. In the hands of clumsy practitioners of psychohistory, influential, energetic, highly effective persons were reduced to a patient on a doctor's couch. Perhaps we learned something from the analysis, but we lost much more, the whole powerful personality we were trying to understand. Erickson seemed to avoid these pitfalls. Important to me as a historian was his technique of combining history and psychology in a view of historical leadership. In his view, the people who confronted the underlying tensions of a period and offered a resolution were precisely the ones who exercised the greatest influence. Erickson thought Luther spoke to his generation because he confronted the deep issues of his time. He incorporated into his inner life the crises of an age, and in battling for personal stability, or salvation in his case, he did the work for a whole generation. In a sense, Luther was a sick man, but he suffered from the sickness of his times. Without having suffered, he could not have led. That he came through these trials and created a functioning psychocultural identity made his life story therapeutic for those who heard it. He was listened to because he spoke for the struggles of his people. All these Ericksonian notions were in the back of my mind as I worked on Joseph Smith over the past 8 years. I really didn't set out to do a deep psychological portrait of the prophet. I knew I lacked Erickson's finesse, but after completing the biography last year, I realized that Erickson's influence could be seen in its pages. Without really taking conscious thought, I had introduced psychological themes into my account and given them an Ericksonian turn. I had come to believe that Joseph was influential because of his personal struggles. He confronted the issues of his time, and if he did not find complete solutions, he dealt with them in his life and teachings. He was an example of a person leading from weakness transformed into strength. Ericksonian psychology was especially evident in my treatment of two issues: fatherhood and the sealing of families. Both of these were personal to Joseph Smith and at the same time essential to his doctrine. In fatherhood and sealing, I found instances of the psychological, the religious, and the historical intermingling, as Erickson said they must. In a television interview soon after the publication of The Beginnings of Mormonism, the reporter asked me who was most influential in Joseph Smith's life, his father or his mother. I balked at this unanswerable question. But if I asked again, I would probably say his father. Joseph Jr. was extraordinarily loyal to Joseph Sr. Joseph Jr. went to such pains to honor his father, one wonders if he was compensating for some underlying shame. He called Joseph Sr. to be patriarch of the church and sat him in the highest place in the ascending pulpits in the Kirtland Temple. In a blessing, Joseph said his father would sit with the great patriarchs of the Bible in the last day. Joseph Jr.'s love must have gone back to the leg operation when he said he could bear the pain if his father would hold him in his arms. His father must have been an attractive man, tall, straight, and handsome. Lucy once imagined him as a tall tree swaying in a field with a band of burnished gold surrounding him. Irresistibly drawn to him, Joseph Jr. stood by his father in all his trials. When Lucy and 3 of the children joined the Palmyra Presbyterian Church in the 1820s, Joseph Jr. stayed home with his father. Joseph shared his father's low opinion of the churches. Joseph Sr.'s 5 religious dreams opened onto a desolate landscape where religion and salvation were not to be found. He was wandering alone and endlessly seeking. In real life, he periodically tried to attend church with Lucy, but then pulled back, repelled by some lack or fault. His dreams show him to be desperately hungry for salvation, but incapable of finding it. By age 12, Joseph Jr. shared his father's opinions. Even before the first vision, Joseph Jr. had concluded that mankind had apostatized from the true and living faith. Both father and son were confused about religion, wanting salvation, but unsure where to look. Although offering no leadership himself, Joseph Sr.'s example kept Joseph Jr. from joining the Presbyterian Church with Lucy. Joseph showed more emotion at his father's baptism on the day of the church's organization than at any other time of his life. Lucy said that Joseph Jr. grasped his father's hand as he came from the water and cried out, "Oh my God, have I lived to see my own father baptized into the true church of Jesus Christ?" According to Joseph Knight, the prophet burst out with grief and joy and seemed as though the world could not hold him. He went out into the lot and appeared to want to get out of sight of everybody and would sob and cry and seemed to be so full that he could not live. Knight and Oliver Cowdery went after Joseph and finally brought him back to the house. "He was the most wrought upon I ever saw any man," Knight said. "His joy seemed to be full." The incident not only spoke for the bond between father and son, but that Joseph Jr. had taken responsibility for his father's salvation. A few years later, in an unguarded moment, Joseph told his brother William that "I brought salvation to my father's house as an instrument in the hands of God when they were in a miserable situation." One of the few instances when Joseph acknowledged his father had been a failure. Joseph Sr. was no more successful economically than he was religiously. He had begun life auspiciously with a farm provided by his father Asel and a $1,000 nest egg from Lucy's brother Stephen and his partner. But he had lost both through bad judgment and the villainy of a business partner. For 14 years he moved from one tenant farm to another. With the help of his sons, he tried again in Manchester to purchase a farm, but failed to make the payments and lost the property. Whereas his grandfather, Samuel, was a respected farmer and a town leader at the peak of Topsfield society, Joseph Sr. dropped into the lower ranks of rural society in Vermont and New York. At age 54, he had nothing. He had failed in the primary responsibility of farm fathers in those days, to support his family from day to day and at the same time accumulate enough in addition to give his sons and daughters a start in life. Families hoped to get ahead of their everyday needs in the years when the older boys were still working for their fathers before striking out on their own. Joseph Sr. had the boys, but overextended himself in the building of a frame house to replace their log cabin. He could not make the payments on both house and land, and by trying for too much, he lost all. Asel had given his boys farms as they came of age in Vermont. Joseph Sr. had nothing to give. Instead, he was reduced to living with Hiram and his wife. As he entered his declining years, he had neither religion nor land to offer his family. Broken by circumstances and bad luck, he turned to drink and to treasure-seeking. His drinking was not excessive for his time. It was a period of increasing alcohol consumption, resulting eventually in the temperance movement of the 1830s. The critical neighbors' affidavits never implied that he led his family to rack and ruin, as happened in the worst cases. But his drinking was a source of shame and added to his feeling of failure. At first, he was not ashamed of the treasure-seeking, which the neighbors ridiculed him for. Joseph Sr. must have felt that his son's gifts for seeing in a stone gave him an advantage in the search for lost treasure, the resort of the poor all over New England in those times. For 4 or 5 years after 1822, when Joseph Jr. found a seerstone in a well, Joseph Sr. pressed his son to help with the expeditions, doubtlessly hoping to recover from his losses in farming. Finally, in 1826, Joseph Sr. acknowledged that here, too, he had gone astray. Joseph Jr.'s marvelous gifts, he said at his son's 1826 trial, should be used for higher purposes. Joseph Sr.'s was a sad story, but not an uncommon one. It was an age of failed fathers. We celebrate the westward movement and the growth of cities as signs of American optimism and enterprise, but they were more often than not the outcome of failed farm families. Fathers could not accumulate sufficient land to provide for their children, and so were forced to sell and move on. In Indiana, settlers squatted on fresh land for 20 years, and at the end still lacked the cash to purchase the land they had worked, compelling them to move again. In Rhode Island, fathers put their wives and children into the spinning mills to make the money the farm could not provide. In Massachusetts, daughters worked in the mills while their mothers ran boarding houses after the family farmsteads were lost through debt. Every move to the city, every trek west, was more likely than not to indicate the old system was broken. Fathers could not provide for their children in towns where their ancestors had lived for generations. Thomas Lincoln, the father of Abraham, began with 3 farms in Kentucky when his son was young. In 1816, the same year the Smiths moved to Palmyra, faulty titles forced Thomas to sell the land at a loss and move across the Ohio to Indiana. There he worked a backcountry farm with the help of his children. But that operation failed, and his fortunes were running downhill. And Abraham Lincoln, at that point, bailed out. He could see that his father would have little to offer his son. Abraham left the family and moved into storekeeping, politics, and law, where there were brighter prospects. He attended to his father as best he could, but had little hope for his economic recovery. Lincoln subscribed to the Whig program of bolstering the market economy, canals and roads, protective tariffs, and a national bank. Only by turning to commercial agriculture, Lincoln believed, would men like Thomas Lincoln get ahead. Losing patience with his family's frequent request for loans, Abraham refused to visit his father in his final illness and was not present at the funeral. Joseph Sr.'s prospects were even dimmer than Thomas Lincoln's, but Joseph Jr. never gave up on his flawed, lovely father. In late 1833 or 34, Joseph ordained his father as patriarch. Although couched in formal language, Joseph's blessing on Joseph Sr. expressed the feelings of a son for a father who had suffered repeated defeats. This was a man who had lost 2 farms and at age 58, when the church was organized, was back in Tennessee with no house or land to call his own. Defeated by the rigors of the economic order, he was told by his son he would be a prince over his posterity. "Blessed of the Lord is my father," Joseph said, "for he shall stand in the midst of his posterity, and shall be comforted by their blessings when he is old and bowed down with years, and he shall be called a prince over them." Like Adam, he would assemble his children, his one undoubted accomplishment, and sit in the general assembly of patriarchs, even in council with the Ancient of Days, when he shall sit and all the patriarchs with him, and shall enjoy his right and authority under the direction of the Ancient of Days. Whatever else Joseph Sr. lacked, the blessing said, his seed shall rise up and call him blessed. His name shall be had in remembrance to the end. Joseph Sr. seemed to understand that his sons had redeemed his life. When he blessed Joseph and Hiram in December 1834 as a patriarch, he thanked them for enduring the hardships of their early lives. Hiram, Joseph Sr. said, had borne the burden and heat of the day and labored much for the good of thy father's family. The father was grateful for Hiram's kindness in tolerating Joseph Sr.'s weakness. Thou hast always stood by thy father and reached forth a helping hand to lift him up. And when he was in affliction, and though he has been out of the way through wine, thou hast never forsaken him, nor laughed him to scorn. Joseph Sr.'s candid words speak the sorrows of a failing father in a cruel time. Besides his business failures, his weakness for wine brought him down and opened him to the scorn of his own children. Joseph Sr. was grateful that his sons did not laugh. For all these kindnesses the Lord my God will bless thee. In return, he could bless Hiram with the same blessings with which Jacob blessed his son Joseph, for thou art his true descendants. He could not give his son wealth, but he could say, thy posterity shall be numbered with the house of Ephraim, and with them thou shalt stand up to crown the tribes of Israel. Joseph Sr. could make these promises because Joseph Jr. had given him priesthood, while the father had given his son only hardship. Joseph Sr.'s blessing on Joseph Jr. acknowledged that thou hast suffered much in thy youth, and the poverty and affliction of thy father's family have been a grief to thy soul. Joseph Jr. had mourned his family's humiliations and assumed responsibility for lifting them up from their low state. As his father put it, thou hast stood by thy father, and like Shem would have covered his nakedness, rather than see him exposed to shame. There must have been time when the father had gone through public humiliation. When the daughters of the Gentiles laughed, he said to his son, thy heart has been moved with a just anger to avenge thy kindred. The words may explain why Joseph joined his father in money-digging ventures despite his reluctance, why he stayed home from church when his mother took the other children to Presbyterian meetings, why Joseph wept when his long unchurched father was baptized into the Church of Christ on its day of organization. He had made his father's pain his own. Now at last the father could bless his son with the blessings of thy fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Joseph Sr. had given his son nothing for a worldly inheritance, and Joseph Jr. had met this lack by giving his father the power to bless his sons. Joseph Sr.'s blessings suggest the personal meaning of priesthood to early members. whether weak or strong, rich or poor, priesthood holders could pass priesthood to their sons. The 1835 priesthood revelation named the patriarchs who received the priesthood from Father Adam: Seth, Enos, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, and Methuselah. As a later revelation was to say, the priesthood came down from the fathers. Priesthood was a father's legacy to his son, counting for more than lands and herds. In the overall plan, material possessions had a part too. Zion promised an inheritance to all who migrated there. Fathers in Zion who lacked the wealth to provide for their children, as many did in this fast-moving age, were promised land in the holy city. The word inheritance, for describing properties in Zion, expressed a father's wish to bestow a legacy on his children. In restoring priesthood, Joseph restored fatherhood. Now on to sealing. I first became aware of Joseph's intense relationship with his father in reading Joseph Knight's account of Joseph Sr.'s baptism, where Joseph Jr. basked out with grief and joy. It was obvious from that incident alone how much of the son's life was bound up in his father's. I began to examine sealing, my second psychohistorical theme, after reading the priesthood marriage revelation closely. I was struck with the concern about family relations coming to an end. All covenants, contracts, bonds, obligations, oaths, vows, performances, connections, associations, every kind of human relationship are of no efficacy, virtue, or force in and after the resurrection unless entered into and sealed by the Holy Spirit of promise of him who is anointed. Though ordained by thrones or principalities or powers, every worldly relationship not sealed by God shall be thrown down and shall not remain after men are dead. To me, the revelation showed a fear of terminations and an intense desire to stabilize human relationships. According to its principles, husbands who are sealed to their wives will attain to unimaginable glory, while those who are not sealed will remain alone. Glory is juxtaposed against loneliness. The Baptism for the Dead letter of September 1842 stresses much the same point. Joseph was thrilled to discover that by baptizing and recording, he could seal human relationships after death. The nature of this ordinance, the letter said, consists in the power of the priesthood by the revelation of Jesus Christ, wherein it is granted that whatsoever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Creating these ties, the letter went on, was of utmost importance. It is sufficient to know, Joseph wrote, that the earth will be smitten with a curse unless there is a welding link of some kind or other between the fathers and the children upon some subject or other. Joseph seems to be saying the situation was desperate. He had written earlier that unless the hearts of the fathers were turned to the children and unless the heart of the children turned to their fathers and the fathers to the children, the whole earth would be utterly wasted at his coming. Families had to be welded or all was lost. Especially in the closing years of his life, Joseph talked often of death and separation. He worried that people would lose track of one another in the resurrection. He proposed to build a tomb for all of his family so that they could rise together and clasp hands. Here's him speaking. If I had no expectation of seeing my mother, brother, and sisters and friends again, my heart would burst in a moment, and I should go down to my grave. The expectation of seeing my friends in the morning of the first resurrection cheers my soul and enabled him to bear up against the evils of life. One of the advantages of gathering to Nauvoo was the opportunity afforded to be buried near to one another, that in the morn of the resurrection they may come forth in body and come right up out of the graves and strike hands immediately in eternal glory.